another session in our lecture series on Chinese philosophy in Western languages. Today's topic is not really about Chinese philosophy, but it is a very important and urgent issue which we'll be addressing today. I'm very honored that we have invited Professor Lorenzo from the National Chengchi University. We have him here, and I will just briefly introduce him and say a few words on his work, and then we begin his talk. And let's begin. Professor Lorenzo has widely published on issues like comparative political theory, international studies, and American political theory. He has published 3 books, and his most recent book is called Conceptions of Chinese Democracy, reading Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and Jiang Jingguo with Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. And he's also widely published articles on various issues from John Locke to Gladstone to Roger Smith and other issues, which are somehow also relate to Taiwan and to Taiwanese issues, Chinese issues. So the reason why I invite him today is, of course, first that today is a very special date, June 4th. So I think we need to reflect on this particular day on the possibility and the historical meaning of democracy in China and Chinese-speaking countries like Taiwan. So this is the particular reason I invited him today. And the second reason is, of course, that Professor Lorenzo is a specialist in what I would call comparative political theory. So he is interested in how traditions of political thought worldwide, not only in the Western context, but the non-Western context, are rearticulated in modern societies. So already in his first book, that is called Tradition and the Rhetoric of Right, Popular Political Arguments in the Aurobindo Movement, he tackles this very interesting issue, how tradition-based arguments are reused or are used in contemporary contexts. So the question I think we are all somehow concerned with is, of course, how in Taiwanese society or an Asian society Confucian or Taoist-based arguments can have some sort of normative force or appeal to in contemporary political frameworks like the Taiwanese democracy. So I think this is particular research focus is one reason why I invited Professor Lorenzo. And as you will see in his talk today, he is very interested in how these kind of arguments, tradition-based arguments, can work or can play out their normative value today. And he has other books and articles. One book I should mention is Cities at the End of the World, which he published, I think, 2 years ago.
Actually this year.
Oh, this year, okay. In which he tackles the themes of utopian and dystopian writing, and so in particular in literature, and from George Orwell to much less known books in the 19th century. And so the topic of his talk today is some conception of democracy on Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. And maybe I think I shouldn't say more. I just tell you that we have a respondent. This is Professor Chen today, Professor Chen Yaohua. She will, after Professor Lorenzo's talk, she will give us some sort of response, and then we have we have more time or enough time for a Q&A session. So maybe let's begin, and welcome, Professor Lorenzo.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. We were just talking on the way over about the problems of thinking in terms of comparative political thought and whether or not particular concepts can really be translated well from one tradition to another. And I mentioned to him that in this book, which I'll be talking about today, I'm guilty of that, of making some fairly quick and dirty kinds of comparisons. And I'm doing the same thing here. So this is a talk I've given in the States. I gave in the States a couple of months ago at universities in the Boston area. And I felt much more comfortable there because I was speaking to an audience which is pretty much ignorant of Chinese philosophy, except for a few exceptions. So I feel a little more intimidated here. So because I'm in that sense, I'm a relative newcomer to this kind of thing. So forgive any dirtiness in my analysis here, because I am trying to think comparatively here, and I realize that sometimes attempts at comparison just don't work as well in reality as they appear to you on paper. So having that with that in mind, this again is a presentation I give in the States, so it's probably not quite as sophisticated as I would ordinarily give, but I think it does capture at least some of the things that I talk about in the book, and I hope it will provide you with some things to think about. So this is about democracy in Taiwan and to a certain extent on the Chinese mainland, and the big methodological question that I first had to tackle in writing the book was really how do we think about the study of democracy? If I'm going to talk about conceptions of democracy in Taiwan and on the mainland, what is it that I'm talking about? So what I do in both the book and here is I talk about different ways of thinking about democracy, and one way of doing so is to think about it in a completely pluralist fashion. To say that democracy doesn't have any universal definition, but only has meaning within the context of particular cultural traditions. And so for someone like Liu Kuan-yu, there is this distinctive kind of Chinese understanding of democracy based on unique Chinese cultural elements. These stress the family, the group authority, discipline. So in this understanding, Chinese democracy is different from Western democracy and should not be held to the same standards as Western democracy. You shouldn't even compare it with Western democracy. It's an indigenous conception. It's best suited to the Chinese context. It's better than this alien Western understanding, because the Western understanding was developed within quite different political, economic, and cultural contexts. Now, I don't, in the context of the book and more generally, I don't buy this. Even though this is about conceptions of Chinese democracy, and I do talk about Chinese democracy in particular context, I don't think there is necessarily a distinctive overall conception of democracy that's purely Chinese. I think there are, and as we'll see in just a second, what I argue is that there are models of democracy that have been built within the Chinese context, and these resemble more or less models that you can find in the Western context. But I'm not comfortable with this methodological position that there is this distinctive Chinese understanding, and it cannot be compared, it cannot be criticized. And that's in part because I studied with this guy. This is Robert Dahl. And I was giving this talk, my mentor, Bob Dahl, I only took 2 seminars from him, in Boston, and I find out the next day that Bob had passed away. So I talk about, Bob says this, Bob says that, and I look at the paper yesterday, he had passed. So this is the late Bob Dahl. He has, along with many Western theorists, have a completely opposite understanding than the pluralists do. He would argue that democracy is a singular, universal concept that must be understood in the same way across political and cultural contexts. So for Dahl, democracy entails accountability, importantly through elections, choices among the programs of political parties, constitutionalism, and the protection of liberal freedoms. So for him, really democracy equals what other people would argue is liberal democracy. And if you look at his arguments about polyarchy, he emphasizes the internal pluralism of societies, the importance of different groups in a democracy being able to compete for power, the importance of protections of individual rights, etc., etc. So for him, now he does argue that this full conception of democracy doesn't arise until really the 20th century. He talks about it as a part of a kind of a revolution of democratic thinking. But for him, this is democracy. Democracy has a singular, universal meaning. Now, as much as I respect Bob, I don't entirely buy his understanding. I am much more drawn to the work of David Held, who argues that in fact there are different understandings, different models of democracy that you can find. And so if you ask if you ask your students, as this cartoon says, what's democracy? What is democracy? Is the freedom to elect our dictators. That's really one of the models that sort of one of the models that Held talks about. But more generally, he talks about a core conception of democracy that must be included in various conceptions. And that's importantly accountability to the general population. But more, he holds that there are different models that represent distinctive democratic practices. So he identifies these variations in the ways accountability is implemented, how power is held and exercised, and the rights and duties of citizens. So, for example, if you think about accountability, accountability can come about because leaders are elected and they must subject themselves to election periodically in order to exercise power. That's one understanding of accountability to the general population. Another understanding of accountability is the general population makes the decisions, and they're accountable to themselves, right? But the first understanding talks about elected leaders making decisions. You elect people, they make the decisions. So an indirect democratic system. The other is a direct democratic system. They're two different conceptions, but they still have a core understanding of accountability. It's just that accountability is understood differently, right? So in that understanding, or in Held's understanding, you can have variations in democracy. Democracy can take on different faces in different places. So what I really do is to use Held's understanding while using also important parts of Bob Dahl's definition. I don't go so far as to say you can take any conception, slap the label of democracy on it, and you have a democracy. Importantly, there has to be a workable mechanism by which the people who make decisions are accountable to the general population. Now, what I do is talk about various models of democracy in the context of discussing what Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and Chengchi will say about democracy. And I talk about a liberal model, what I call, and what Held calls a Republican unitary model, and what I call a Chinese unitary model, along with another model that emphasizes elitism, which is a kind of an elective elitist understanding. So liberal democracy, democratic elitism, Republican unitary democracy, and Chinese unitary democracy. Okay, so for a general definition, democracy is a system of government in which those who make policies and decisions for the community and who generally use state power are responsible to citizens, and citizens constitute the large majority of adult residents. Now, a liberal understanding of democracy will assume pluralism, assumes that citizens have different interests, they have different political values. Such an understanding talks about the importance of constitutions, the laws and courts, the importance of constraining majorities, the importance of protecting minorities. So a liberal democracy is pluralistic, it's not mobilizational, it assumes that there is this large area of private concerns for citizens. There's a large area of private organizations that citizens can become involved in that aren't associated with the state. It assumes general equality, but also the importance of elected leaders who make policies even though they are responsible to the general public. Okay, competitive elitism is an understanding in which democracy is conceived of as the election of leaders who act as trustees, i.e., they make their own judgments about what good policies should be. Citizens are understood as importantly unequal in their intelligence and abilities. So democracy really means you choose the leaders who make decisions. And there is the assumption that ordinary citizens are only going to be able to critique leaders in only very general ways. They're not necessarily going to understand the complexities of policy making. Policy making is really for experts. This understanding also talks about leaders being associated with political parties. So for democratic elitism, democracy is pluralistic. There are competitive elections that are held in which citizens choose among leaders with different platforms. So it assumes that citizens are plural. It assumes that the general good can be understood in a variety of different ways. And it's also not mobilization. Okay, Republican unitary democracy. The demos is understood as unitary. It's not pluralistic. There's emphasis on the common good and the common will. Citizens are supposed to be highly participatory. They're supposed to cultivate political virtues. This kind of democracy is often mobilizational. Sometimes it emphasizes the importance of complete, direct democracy. This is a model that's championed by Rousseau, to some extent Machiavelli. So this model is not pluralistic, it's not elitist, and it often is mobilizational. Okay. Chinese unitary democracy. This is a label I sort of slap on this understanding that I found in various places. It's a model derived from traditional understandings of good government in the Chinese political tradition. Good government is people-centered or minbang. Democracy and strong government are necessary to address the large problems that face China. Juan, there's a unitary understanding of the demos. It's mobilizational. It often or sometimes emphasizes traditional virtues, derived quite often from Confucian understandings. And this, rather than civic republican virtues, is one of the things that differentiates it from the republican, the unitary model. So, now the other part of this is, it is elitist. It's an elitist, unitary, mobilizational understanding, and it's not pluralistic. So actually, it deviates from the Republican unitary model, which is a Western model, in two ways. One is it's elitist, and second, it talks about traditional cultural values, not the kinds of civic Republican values that the Republican unitary model talks about in the Western tradition. Okay, so that's the framework of different understandings of democracy that I use in order to then examine what Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and Chengchi said about democracy. So, just to set this up, Taiwan right now is recognized as being a democracy because it's understood as having undergone a democratic transition in the late 1980s. But if you were to resurrect Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, they probably wouldn't be very happy about that, but if you resurrected them, put them in this room, and you said, Taiwan is now a democracy because it underwent a democratic transition in the late 1980s, they would say, oh, hell no. It was a democracy before then. Chiang Kai-shek would have said that at the very least he presided over a nation that was democratizing, if not a full-fledged democracy. So to say that Taiwan underwent a democratic transition in the 1980s where it went from being an authoritarian government to a democratic government I would bet you all kinds of money would meet with very strong arguments from both of them. You know, luckily they're not around to argue this, but I'm sure that would be the case. Because both of them said that they were Democrats, both of them said that they were in favor of democracy, and both of them put forward understandings of democracy that deviated in significant respects from a liberal model. Excuse me. Okay. Now, Sun is, of course, writing at the end of the Qing dynasty in the early Republican era. He is drawn towards democracy. And he's drawn towards democracy, importantly, because he thinks it is the modern form of government. And he thinks that China needs a modern form of government. Sorry. Somebody's been calling me constantly today. It's completely unknown. Okay. He's drawn towards democracy because he thinks it's a modern form of government. He thinks it's the form of government that is responsive to modern context, and he thinks it's the foundation for creating a strong state. And that's what he really wants. He wants China to have a strong state, to fight off the imperialists, to be able to unite internally, to be able to modernize, to take its place again among the community of nations as a respected member. And when he looks around at Western models, he says, well, you know, one reason why we know democracy is strong is because these Western powers are democracy and they're beating up on China. But he admires them for their external strength, but he doesn't think internally that Western liberal democracies are the answer to China's problems, because he thinks that the state itself internally is too weak. Liberal democracy puts too many safeguards and shackles on state power. It doesn't allow leaders to make the decisions that need to be made. It doesn't allow the state to do the things that need to be made. So he argues that the Western liberal understanding of democracy is not something that is suitable for China. It's the product of Western history. Is the product of a Western suspicion of the state. Is the product of a harsh Western feudalism during the Middle Ages. But all of that is not applicable to China. In China, the state has historically been weak. And the problem hasn't been the state, but the monopolization of power by families that creates danger. So Western liberal states put too much emphasis on individualism. China is fragmented and has all the individualism it can really stand. What's needed is more unity and solidarity in the form of nationalism. Now, an important part of why he gravitates towards democracy, again, first he argues that he has a contextual argument for democracy. Democracy is suited for modern conditions in which the greatest problems are internal. But he also argues that China faces important kinds of, let me see if I have this on the slide, important kinds of tasks that require all citizens to participate. And the only way of really getting the wholehearted participation of citizens behind the state, the only way to make them really support the state and make it into a strong state, is if you give ordinary citizens some stake, some way of thinking that the state is actually working for them, that it is it is their state. So democracy is a type of government that expresses the will of all the people. And only that kind of government is capable of gaining the loyalty, trust, and support of all citizens. And it's the only form of government that's really capable of controlling the kind of powerful state that's essential to accomplish the large task that China has to accomplish. But there's a problem here. And again, this is something that he refers to in terms of his rejection of important Western conceptions. The conception of democracy in the West is fundamentally based, at some level, on the notion that everybody is equal. The democratic ethos is an ethos of equality. And at a fundamental level, Sun rejects this. He does not think that people are equal in terms of their abilities. So there's a tension in Sun's understanding of democracy as a popular form of government. It has to include some participatory elements. Otherwise, people aren't going to buy that it's really democracy. But he also wants to think about democracy as just another form of government that has to take into account the nature of political work and the unequal characteristics of humans. And both of those things really point to the importance of leaders and expertise. So, you have to have an elitist democracy, because humans are highly different in their abilities. Humans range from sages to inferior people. Only people who have the highest abilities and trained in relevant subjects should be eligible to be officials. Ordinary citizens are supposed to choose among such highly trained people, hold them accountable only in the most general sense by setting national goals, voting in elections, and participating in recalls, referenda, and initiatives. But the latter three, I think, he believes should be exceptional. Otherwise, elites are selected to office or to have a free hand in creating policies. citizens are to defer to their expertise. Now, as I note here, he thinks about himself as a democratic theorist. And he thinks about his understanding of democracy as an advanced form of general democracy. He's a universalist. He argues that this model should theoretically apply everywhere. But he also says China is importantly different from the West. He does recognize at least some understandings of pluralism in terms of democracy. He says the American conception of liberal democracy is suited for America. American liberal democracy is really democracy with American characteristics, right? But there is this larger overall understanding of democracy. He thinks of himself as a democratic theorist, not as a theorist of Chinese democracy. Okay, so what about Sun's conception of democracy? It's going to be elitist. You're not going to have ordinary people participating in policymaking, except when they engage in referenda and initiatives. And initiatives are really policymaking, but he wants to incorporate that. So there, again, there's tension here. It's going to be unitary. Policy should express the undivided will of the community. He assumes that there's going, at least China needs a period of tutelage. Democracy for Sun is not natural. It's artificial. All forms of government are artificial. So people have to be trained in their understanding of it. He emphasizes a strong state. He seems to assume a single party. Now, he does talk about choosing among leaders, but it really looks like he's talking about this within the context of a single organization. He does talk about participation, but again, it's within the context of recall initiative and referenda, but it's also mobilizational. The state is going to mobilize the population to engage in these large projects of modernization, industrialization, and so forth. And it assumes a united demos, again, possibly attained by training in patriotic virtues that would be part of tutelage. He does talk a little bit about traditional virtues, but not nearly as much as Chiang Kai-shek does. Now, the central understanding of democracy that Sun provides is in the story of the hired car, right? You're familiar with the story of the hired car? Okay. Sun is going to go to an important meeting in Shanghai, and he needs to get there in like half an hour. And he says, okay, I'm going to hire a car and a driver to get me there. And he says, okay, I need to be at this location on the other side of Shanghai in half an hour. Get me there in time for my meeting. And the driver starts taking this long roundabout way of getting there. And Sun's like, what's going on? What's going on? We're going to be late. We're going to be late. Why isn't he taking the direct route? But he gets there in time, and he says to the driver, why did you take this long roundabout way? He says, oh, well, you know, if we'd gone the direct route, there would have been too much traffic. We wouldn't have been able to get here in time. And Sun says, aha, that's democracy. Now, how is that democracy? There's a person who sets the destination. That's Sun, right? He's the one who sets the destination. That's the goal. That's where you want to get. Now, is there more than one person there? No. The demos is singular. It has one will. It's not a bunch of people in the back of the car arguing about where they're going, right? And while the choice is subjective, it can be objectively understood. He selects to attend the meeting and be there at a particular time, right? But once he's identified that, somebody can objectively understand that. You can understand, this is where you need to go, and this is the time you need to be there. There's no subjectivity about understanding the goal once it's selected. Okay? Now, how does he get there? Does he drive himself there? No. He has a chauffeur, so to speak. Who is the chauffeur? He's an expert. He's an expert in the car. He knows how to maintain it. He knows how to drive it. He knows the correct routes to get to the place where Sun wants to go. Sun is the demos. The driver is a political leader. Right? He's there because he's an expert. And he's there because Sun doesn't know how to drive a car. He doesn't know how to maintain a car. He doesn't know how to get to the correct places. And what does Sun do in terms of trusting the driver? He trusts the driver to select the correct routes, because that's within the driver's area of expertise. He wants to question them, but he realizes he doesn't have sufficient expertise in order to do so. The driver knows best. The driver knows how to get to the destination. Now, what are they sitting in? They're sitting in a car. What is a car? A car is a mechanical being. It doesn't have a will of its own. It only goes somewhere if it's being driven, and it's a powerful entity. It's more powerful than horses. It's more powerful than people. It doesn't have a will of its own. It doesn't have interests of its own. So you don't have to be suspicious of it. If there's nobody driving it, it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to run you over. It's not going to suddenly start, go to the mountains rather than, to the meeting. Right? So it's a completely inert piece of machinery unless somebody gets behind the wheel, starts it, and drives it. So that's his understanding of democracy. A singular will that identifies the goals that are to be reached. You reach those means by means of a powerful state, which doesn't have interests of its own, which can't do things by itself, and in order for it to do anything, it is controlled by a driver who is marked by his expertise in not only driving the car, i.e. administering the state, but in choosing the correct routes to the goals that have been chosen, i.e. policies. So that's Sun's understanding of the state. Don't have a bunch of people arguing about where to go. You don't have passengers driving the car. You don't have a car that goes somewhere of its own will. So you can trust the car, you can trust the driver, because they're experts. Okay, Chiang Kai-shek adopts many of the parts of Sun's understanding of democracy. He adopts the elitist understanding. You have to allow officials to exercise their expertise. He argues for unity. He argues for a communal will. Now, where Sun is probably a little bit closer to the Republican unitary Rousseauian model of people are united through nationalism, people are united through political activities. Chiang Kai-shek talks about unity being derived through the practice of Confucian values, traditional Chinese values. He's also in favor of mobilization through government leadership. Now, he does differ in certain important respects from Sun Yat-sen. He talks about democracy being natural. He talks about it being part of human nature, and he talks about it being part of the Tao. So it's part of the structure of the universe, and it's something within humans. So it comes from, it's natural in both ways, from above and from within. Whereas Sun says, there are all different kinds of governments, none of them are natural, and the justification for governments are really contextual. They fit with the spirit of their times. And conceivably, we could reach a post-democratic society in which the problems that are presented would require a post-democratic government. If you read Chiang Kai-shek, it would appear as if he rejects that. Chiang Kai-shek also roots democracy a little more deeply within traditional Chinese culture. Sun Yat-sen talks about democracy as being, yeah, there are there's people-centered elements in traditional Chinese culture, but really the concept of democracy is A, something modern, and B, conceptually it came from the West. Chiang Kai-shek says democracy is implicit in Chinese culture, and attaining democracy is really reaching the culmination of Chinese culture itself. And so in places he really argues that to be a good Chinese person, you have to be a Democrat. He's also somewhat, in places, a little more liberal than Sun Yat-sen. He places more emphasis on the Constitution. He makes gestures towards checks and balances, though in practice, of course, he doesn't really fulfill those. For Sun, there's the five-fingered Constitution. But the way this was explained to me by a member of the KMT, he says, well, yeah, Sun talks about the five-fingered Constitution, but it's not this, it's this. Yes. That's what it is. And so that sort of sums up Sun's understanding of separation of powers and checks and balances. At least rhetorically, Chiang Kai-shek goes a little bit further and talks about the importance of those, but what that means in practice, well, not that much. But he does conceptually provide that kind of discussion. But on the other hand, he does have this strongly Confucian side where he criticizes individualism, he criticizes Western individualism. He sometimes criticizes, or it seems to criticize, Western liberal democracy as not providing sufficient instruments of discipline for ordinary citizens. And therefore, he says, that results in a great deal of problems within society, a great deal of confusion and conflict, and it ultimately leads to fascism. So his understanding is that really that Western individualism is what leads to problems of fascism. So like Sun, he talks about a unitary, elitist understanding of democracy with some more liberal elements involved. He's probably a little bit closer to the Chinese unitary model than is Sun. Sun is maybe a little bit closer to the Republican unitary model. Sun talks about, Rousseau is wrong, Rousseau is wrong, but really Sun in some cases looks an awful lot like Rousseau. Okay, let me go through some quickly. Okay, Taiwan, of course, is now considered to be a liberal democracy. It's experienced a transition from authoritarian rule. It has a mixed system. It has a constitution. It has a list of protected liberal rights. It has a fairly robust civil society. And it also contains these elements that like to bypass institutions like the Sunflower Movement and these other kinds of movements, which are an important part of this mobilizational heritage, I would argue. You could argue that it's influenced by traditional Chinese cultural traditions, it's influenced by Western political values, and the example of contemporary democracy movements in the Philippines and in South Korea, and also possibly the civil rights movement in the U.S. I argue it's also importantly influenced by Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek in terms of the repeated discussions about consensus, the repeated instances of mobilization you find particularly on the green part of the political spectrum, which is interesting. The green part of the political spectrum talks a lot about mobilization. The blue side doesn't. The blue side is sort of jettisoning that, and it talks more in terms of elitism. The green side talks importantly about people being involved, of people tackling large issues. So in terms of contemporary practice, I would argue that there still are important elements of unity, elitism, and mobilization that are present. But they're sort of under different guises. Elitism is understood more in terms of an indirect democratic system. I went around and asked people, would you agree with the following? Democracy means electing leaders who then make decisions fairly much autonomously. I asked this of a group of people I was interviewing who were fairly high up in the KMT and the DPP. All of them said yes. That was their understanding of democracy. Democracy is you elect leaders and they're the ones who make the decisions, at least one.
Was it students or something?
These were people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, so it wasn't students, it was other kinds. Unity is generally understood in terms of consensus. And I talk in the book about different ways in which consensus was conceptualized, particularly by Chengchi. Sometimes he talks about consensus being something that emerges from the grassroots, that people get together and they talk about things, and through various kinds of discussion, some sort of general approaches is agreed upon. At other times, he talks about it's leaders who do this. Leaders get together and construct some sort of common understanding out of diverse strands of political thought. So in this understanding of unity as consensus, unity doesn't mean uniformity. Political pluralism is accepted, but it's assumed that out of pluralism comes unity. E pluribus unum, right? Out of many comes one. Out of pluralism comes one. In some way. So pluralism isn't accepted as a permanent state of being. It's a natural state of being that has to be somehow or other rectified, either through further natural processes or through an artificial process of bringing people together. But the end product is supposed to be consensus. It's not supposed to be, I have a majority of votes and therefore I'm going to do what I want to do, and everybody else, you're out of luck. That doesn't appear to be the political norm that is applied in politics. Okay, there's also a somewhat different understanding of mobilization. Under Sun and Chiang Kai-shek, mobilization means everybody gets together behind the leader of the state and they engage in these particular kinds of tasks. Now, mobilization is not supportive of and orchestrated by the government for the purpose of empowering the state. Rather, it's been turned around. Rather than officials mobilizing the population for support and work, oppositional elites engage in mobilizational efforts to attack and topple government officials. It's a kind of direct and crude method of accountability. And it's meant to put pressure on the government between elections or even to undo the result of elections. So the Sunflower Movement, other kinds of movements, are mobilizational or manifestations of mobilization, but they have somewhat different purposes than what Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek talked about. Okay, now moving to the mainland, there are different ways of understanding democracy on the mainland. If you look at what government officials and conservatives say, they talk about democracy within the party, that so long as you have different different groups within the party that compete, so long as there is some sort of understanding of competition within the party, so long as people don't inherit power, so long as the supreme leaders have a fixed term of office, that's democracy. That's it. You don't need anything more. Multi-party elections are dangerous. They can create political and geographical differences, social disharmony. You don't want to go down that road. In particular, you don't want a Gorbachev. They understand Gorbachev as a democratizing figure in Russian politics. And what happened? Russia is eclipsed for the next 20 years and is only now emerging as a great power again. Party government officials that have a lot of leeway because they're experts. Again, people who talk about the Zhang Hu, Hu Jin, some of the important figures who talk about democracy in this way. Democracy activists tend to be quite different. They talk about Western democracy, they talk about liberal models, they talk about the necessity of competition, needing multi-party elections, and they talk about this competition, accountability, importantly because they argue that it's necessary for practical reasons. And here, this sort of goes back to Sun Yat-sen's practical justification for democracy. But where Sun Yat-sen talks about we need democracy because we need a strong state in order to accomplish these tasks, they talk about we need a liberal democratic state because to accomplish the tasks that China faces now, you need various kinds of accountability. You need more information about what ordinary people are experiencing, whether or not policies are working, how it is that policies are working. You need to be able to get rid of bad officials, corrupt officials, inefficient officials, incompetent officials. So they have this pragmatic justification, but it's a pragmatic justification that leads to a different understanding of democracy than the understanding that Sun Yat-sen talks about. And that they respond to this notion that a liberal democracy will lead to China falling apart by saying, if we go along the road that we're going along now, it is going to fall apart because the authoritarian government is not meeting the needs of ordinary people. Authoritarian government is not really undertaking the crucial tasks of economic reform, political reform, social reform that needs to be accomplished. So it's only, in their argument, it's really only a liberal multi-party democracy that will be able to do that. So while conservatives and party officials, when they talk about democracy, they talk about it in terms of elitism, about experts doing their jobs. They talk about it in terms of unity. There has to be a single party or the whole thing's going to fall apart. They partly talk about it in terms of mobilization, but not so much as they used to. But in that sense, they talk about democracy in much the same way that Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek did, the conservatives. The democracy activists talk about democracy in very different ways. They're much more wedded to a liberal model that departs fairly significantly from both the Republican unitary and the Chinese unitary model that they see, that Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek seem to reference. So the debate on the mainland appears to be about types of democracy and their relationship to development. And there are different, of course, different arguments about how economic and political development should play itself out. And there is a fairly significant clash in terms of how it is that people see democracy. Okay, so what about conclusions? Let me just sum up here since I'm running late. A couple of things, again. There's not just one understanding or model of democracy in the world, or even within the Chinese world, even within Taiwan's context. There are lots of different ways of talking about democracy. But it's also important to note that any concept of democracy cannot be seen as being infinitely elastic. The one-party democracy that's being talked about by conservatives on the mainland is importantly deficient because it really doesn't talk about accountability. It talks about, yeah, inter-party competition, yes, representing different kinds of interests within the party, but it really doesn't talk about holding leaders accountable to the general population. And it's also clear that many people in the mainland, while they understand these notions of elitism, they understand these unitarian notions, many people who are talking about democracy outside the government confines are not talking about democracy in those ways. They're talking about it in much more liberal Western terms. They're talking about it perhaps in terms that are like that of Taiwan. And you might be able to argue that Taiwan represents sort of a halfway house between a Chinese unitary understanding and a Western understanding. There are important, of course, liberal elements of democracy in Taiwan, multiple parties, constitution, defense of individual rights, an independent court system. But you also have the importance of discussions about consensus. You have these important mobilizational elements. You have at least some understandings of elitism still. Again, there's still this understanding that, and this sort of pulls in a different direction than the mobilization part, that government officials really should have lots of free rein in order to enact policies, so long as they're doing that within the confines of consensus. So long as there's consensus, then that empowers leaders to do whatever it is that they think is necessary. So it sort of works in ways like the understanding that Sun Yat-sen talked about. It just depends on, where the consensus comes from. And Sun seemed to automatically assume that there would be unity, that political values, that participating in a democracy would automatically create unity. Now the understanding is that among a lot of people that consensus has to be constructed in some way. But once you construct the consensus, then, and during the process of constructing the consensus, you give leaders a lot of leeway, except when they really screw up, and then you take to the streets and you do things to make them very, very uncomfortable. And even that, you could argue, reflects some of the tensions within Sun Yat-sen's model. On the one hand, his model is unitary, it's very elitist. But on the other, he talks about referenda and initiatives, things that are very populist in nature. And you could argue that those kinds of tensions may be replicating themselves in Taiwan right now between the very mobilizational, green-centered sunflower movement and other associated movements, and the continued understanding that democracy really is about electing leaders who make decisions. And so when people on the Chinese mainland look to Taiwan, I think they're seeing, a fairly complex picture. They're seeing, on the one hand, something that looks like a liberal democracy, but also has some other characteristics to it, and some elements might be attractive and some elements might not be attractive. I think that the understandings of consensus will be more attractive to conservative elements on the mainland. The democracy activists on the mainland don't seem to be that enamored with understandings of consensus. They're much more concerned about instituting real competition among truly different political parties with truly different political platforms as a way of holding leaders accountable. And I don't think that they really understand developing mechanisms of consensus are a way of holding leaders accountable. So I think they see some of that on the mainland where people talk about social solidarity and they don't really see that as holding leaders accountable. So they seem to be moving away from that understanding. understanding. It's not entirely clear to me that people in Taiwan. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for this excellent analysis of Chinese and Taiwanese understandings of democracy. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion now. I don't know whether we have class or any other events afterwards. We have at least 40 minutes, I think, 45 minutes. So maybe we ask Chen first for a response and then continue.
Maybe I have some point to make about your speech. First of all, you talk about the Taiwanese conception of democracy, or maybe only Chiang Kai-shek, or I don't know, the Jiang Jingguo's conception. I'm a little bit suspicious because I think the historical difference between China and Taiwan is very obvious because I think Taiwan occupied by Japanese government. So the influences from Japan, I think Taiwan is very big. If you read the Ming's 400 years Taiwanese history, you will find that I think the elite class, they speak Japanese and they study maybe in Tokyo, and they trained by some Japanese scholar, famous scholar, and they got such progress idea at that time. So if you see the breakup of right and left, the Taiwan Culture Organization 文化协会, then you can know that the Marxism at that time so strong because the Lenin the Marxism, they emphasize so much about people's right to self-determination. So Taiwanese people was so fascinating, and they really want to know more about Marxism, about the right to self-determination at that time. So I think this kind of historical special, I think, environment maybe it's not get such much influences from Chiang Kai-shek or even the Chinese culture, if you call that Chinese. So it's for me it's a little bit different than if we talk about the Taiwanese conception of democracy. I would think about Lin Chenlu. I would think about some Lian Wenqing, even the left side people. They mobilized Taiwan's worker, farmer to resist the Japanese government. So it's my first, maybe my first response. My second is about methodology. You talk about their conception of democracy, but the problem is, I think they went through different historical